everyone. Welcome to Asking About Asking, Mastering the Art of Conversational Fundraising, and welcome. So before we get started, I just want to let you know that after the presentation today, you'll have an opportunity to get your questions answered. So in the meantime, you can either type your questions into the chat window as we go along, or just hold them to the end of the presentation and ask them over the phone. And also, we're going to send you a link to download the PowerPoint deck, and we'll also email you the recording, so you'll have both of those as well. I'm very pleased today to introduce our presenter, Kent Stroman. Regarded as America's asking coach, Kent is a talented speaker, insightful advisor, effective communicator, and published author. Since 1976, he has been involved in teaching and organizational leadership, impacting numerous organizations with his passion for excellence. After a 25-year career in higher ed, Kent launched Stroman & Associates, consulting in fundraising, board governance, strategic planning, and leadership development. In addition to a vast portfolio of board experience, Kent is past chairman of the Regional Chamber of Commerce Board and currently serves on the boards of the Association of Fundraising Professionals, Eastern Oklahoma Chapter, Community Foundation, and United Way. Kent's book, Asking About Asking, Mastering the Art of Conversational Fundraising, was released by Charity Channel Press in March of 2001. So now I'll turn it over to Kent. Kent?
Well, thank you, Laura. One small correction, that was March 2011. Thank you for the opportunity, and I wish that we were all in the same room together, but need for us to be able to be connected electronically. I might just mention as we get started the passion behind the book, and I wonder how many people could really identify with this. And that is too many people spending too much time chasing too small gifts from too many donors and making too little impact on those who give and those who receive. I suspect that in one way or another we can all relate to that. I know certainly that's been a part of my heritage. But as we begin, I just want to ask everybody to respond for themselves to this question. That is, what is your biggest obstacle to one-on-one gift solicitation? We've been doing research on this question for quite some time, and I'm going to go to the responses, the results that we've seen from that. But before we do that, again, I'd just like to ask everybody to answer the question for themselves, and I would love to know what your answer is. And so if you didn't get a chance to respond to the poll, if you would, please just email your response to the question. You can reach me at kent@stromanconsulting.com. That's K-E-N-T @stromanconsulting.com. So here are the top 7 responses that we've heard as we've interviewed or interacted with hundreds upon hundreds of executives, board members, fundraising volunteers. And let me just mention that these 7 categories are not in a significant order. But I mentioned in a blog that I wrote a week ago that the number 5 response in terms of biggest obstacles to successful one-on-one gift solicitation is time pressure. And again, this is one of those times when I wish we were all together in the room, but so many times people say, you know, I just don't have the time to go through that intentional process of carefully identifying, researching prospective funders, and then cultivating the relationship with them. And so I just don't have time to do all that. And unfortunately, if we don't have time for the activity, we're not going to be able to reap the rewards. And one of the things that I would just share as we consider that particular obstacle is an adage that perhaps many of us have already heard, and that is the saying goes, what matters gets measured, and what gets measured gets done. And in the area of fundraising, what matters is the amount of dollars that we're generating from charitable sources. And so we need to measure that. And we find that as we do measure the actual results and compare it against the expectation, where we see a difference, that helps us bring focus to what needs to get done. The companion to that I've been sharing is what matters gets scheduled, and what gets scheduled gets done. And so the question that I would raise to those who say, I just don't have time to successfully solicit one-on-one charitable contributions, then we really need to come up with a way to get it on the schedule. And if you don't already have a practice as such, I would just encourage you to start someplace. If you're not getting out and talking face-to-face with people on a regular basis, then I'd say start this week, schedule at least one half a day, and put it on your calendar. I'm going to be out of the office all of Thursday afternoon, available for only one thing, and that is gift cultivation and solicitation. So start small, half a day this week, 2 half days next week, maybe the following week, a day and a half, and increase that to the point where we're spending 2.5, perhaps even 3 days a week face-to-face with those who actually can move our mission forward. There's also this saying that says there's no money in the office. And so until we can get out of the office, it's unlikely that we're going to encounter the funds necessary to move us forward. One other thing that I'll just mention, if we have time later on, we can come back and identify some of the others. But let me just say that another of the responses that is in the top 5 is prospecting, or we don't know who to ask. And so as we go through and talk a little bit about conversational fundraising and the asking model, we'll touch base on that and see if you don't identify some solutions that can help move forward. So I want to just spend a little bit of time talking about an ask. Again, oftentimes we feel like we're not getting the results that we wish when we do make an ask. And many times what I encounter as I work with people is that what seems like a clear ask or request for charitable support in their own mind isn't clear at all on the other side of the table or from the standpoint of the prospective donor. So what we have suggested is that in order to be very clear about the request, that we recommend that you always reduce your writing, reduce your ask to writing. And so on the screen you can see a sample or a draft proposal, and this is fairly simple. You'll notice it's on one page of paper. The references in the lower left-hand corner refer to the chapter and page in the book, Asking About Asking. And so if you have that book, you can follow along and may want to bend down the corner of the page so that you can come back to it later. But there are some key elements in this simple proposal, beginning with who it's to. We want to be very clear. Are we submitting this request to an individual, or as in this case, a couple, or is it going to a foundation or a business? Who is it coming from? What is the specific date that it's being presented? And then specifically, what amount are we asking for? In this example, we see the request is for $1,500,000 over 3 years. The purpose is to fund the campaign that's called No Boundaries, and there's a naming opportunity that comes with this particular request, and that is that the activity room would be named after Betsy Armstrong. And then we have this section that I call the fine print. It's those details, and I always kind of kidding suggest that our fine print should be the same size as the other print. It makes it easier to read, and we have nothing to hide. And so in this example, we're saying the donation will be fulfilled by gifts of stock during each of the 3 years. And it also points out that for a naming right to be finalized, that it will have to be approved by our own board. And then at the bottom, there's a place for the approval of the donors, the date. But the thing that I think is the most important word on this entire page is highlighted at the top, and that's the word draft, D-R-A-F-T. When it comes time to make our request or make the ask, what we want to do is to take this proposal and hand it to the prospective funder and say, over the last few meetings, we've asked for permission to present a proposal that would exactly meet your needs. And we've listened carefully and have put together a first draft and would like for you to review it. What we'd like to do is identify if there's anything on here that you would not be able to enthusiastically approve. And if so, then we will continue to change it until it's exactly right. And so when we place the word draft at the top of our proposal, what it does is gives everyone permission to make adjustments, to make changes. And so the donors can look at that and say, well, the amount's not right, the timing's not right, what have you. Or if there's something on there that seems entirely clear to us but is not clear to the Rutherfords, then we'll happily make that change, that revision, until it exactly meets their needs. And so we begin by getting a picture of what does the ask look like. And think about this piece of paper, this draft proposal, as being the explicit ask. And so what we said is that if we're to be at our greatest effectiveness as fundraisers, we'll do a lot more asking about asking than just making the ask itself. So we have the proposal here, and we're going to come back and make reference to that a little bit later. But before we do that, I just want to make reference to the next slide, and I want to challenge everybody to think in terms of big gifts. The sample gift chart that you see here is based on a $10 million goal, and whether that's the right number for your project or not, we're going to use this as the basis for our discussion and the illustration today. The primary point that I want to make in this slide is that if we're going to raise $10 million, it's not going to be a result of 1 million people each giving us $10. That works on the calculator, but that's the only place where that works. But in fundraising, again, regardless of the size of the goal, we know that there are going to be a handful of gifts at the top that, if we're going to succeed, must come in approximately that level. So in this example, we see a lead gift, the number one gift, at $1.5 million, and then an additional gift of $1 million. Then we see 3 at the $500,000 level, and then 6 at the $250,000 level. That's 11 gifts totaling $5.5 million. Now, the point about big gifts is it's extremely important for us to know what we're looking for, and to be effective, we've got to start at the top and work our way down. And so, with this example, we've got to find one contribution that's in that $1.5 million range. There's oftentimes a temptation, well, I know where we can find $10,000 gifts. You'll notice we need 72 of those. That's a very large number. But here's the point that I want to make, is if we're looking for $10,000 gifts, we will find a few $10,000 gifts. We will also find a lot of gifts that are much smaller. But when we're looking for $10,000 gifts, we'll find 0 gifts of $1.5 million, even though we may be talking to prospects who could give at that level. And so one of the things that I want to encourage for consideration for today's listeners is to ask ourselves, where can I add a 0 to my daily work? And one place to do that would be to add it to the size of the gift that we're looking for. Add 1, 2, or 3 zeros. So if we've been looking for $10,000 gifts, we're going to have to add a couple of zeros to get to $1 million, and then increase that again to get to the point of $1.5 million. But ask yourself, what is the correct, the appropriate amount of money that I'm seeking. And then rather than say no, which is something that we often do for the prospect by not asking, go about seeking for those potential funders who, if they were adequately motivated and fully informed, would have the capability of giving at that level, $1.5 million, over the period of time that we're seeking. Oftentimes in a major campaign, we're talking about a 3-year period. So who do we know, or who is known by those that we do know, who would have the ability, if they were so inclined, to give at that level? So we've got to have a focus on what is our target, and then, as I mentioned earlier, begin at the top of the gift chart and work our way down. Now, once we know what we're looking for, I want to introduce the 10-step staircase. And so many times in our fundraising efforts, we just want to go straight to the, we want to hear yes. That's what stands behind the door at the top of the stairs. We know in order to hear yes, we have to make a request. That's step number 10, asking. But I feel confident to be able to assure you of this, that if that's where we begin, if I show up, I say, hi, my name's Kent. I work for XYZ charity. We need $1.5 million. We don't have it. You do. Can we have it? The response is going to be a very rapid closing of a door, slamming in our face, kick me down to the bottom of the staircase, and good luck. Well, we know that's not an effective way to go about fundraising. So what we have suggested in the book is that we begin by climbing up step number 1, getting acquainted. And actually that ties into one of the top obstacles that's been identified in our research, and that is we just don't have a relationship with the source, individual, business, or foundation, who has the capability and the capacity of funding us at that $1.5 million level. We know who the donor is, but we don't have that connection. So the getting acquainted, oftentimes that will come about as a part of an introduction by someone who is familiar with our organization and is also acquainted with the prospective funder. Many times this comes about through our boardroom. Who do we know? Who among us knows someone at the XYZ Foundation? And then would you introduce us? So in that introductory meeting, we're going to be asking questions in order to get better acquainted. That takes us to step number 2, introducing the project. And it's at that point that we're talking about the mission of the organization, our history, our track record, our achievements, our initiative, what is it that brings us together. And in the case of our example, we have a vision for the next phase of our development. There's a $10 million price tag on it. And so we're introducing the project. On step number 3, we are asking about giving. And one of the things that I love to do as I'm meeting with prospective donors is to ask that question, how did you learn to be so generous? And as we're asking strategic questions, it gives us the opportunity to listen strategically. And I'm amazed at the insight that can be gained when we'll ask a simple but an insightful question like that one. How did you come to be so generous, or where did you learn to give? And so as we do that, we're learning about their priorities, their preferences, their background. We're going to learn about people that are important to them, both from the past and the present. And that will lead then into question number 4, or step number 4, where we're asking about purpose. And here's a question that I love to ask, and that is, when you make a gift, what do you want to accomplish with that? What is your purpose in giving? It's one thing for us to say, we need to build a new school building and it will have an activity center in it. But that's very different than the donors' responses. They start talking about, here's what I want my gift to accomplish. I've heard people talk about a disadvantaged childhood and how they were deprived of certain things growing up, and so their mission, their passion in life, if you would, is to make sure that the children in their community don't have the same experience that they did as a child. That conversation comes about as a result of asking about purpose. One of the very common challenges is our inclination to guess or assume. We'll read something in the newspaper, or someone will report something about a prospective donor, and our inclination is to let that represent 100% of our view of that particular giver. Well, one of the commitments that we make to ourselves, to each other, in the conversational fundraising approach is that we will not assume and we will not guess when we can ask, and we can always ask. And so asking questions about purpose, again, get us out of the guessing game and into relationship building. On step number 5, we're asking about form. You and I realize that in our country, approximately 9% of the wealth is held in a cash or cash equivalent form. The other 91% is held in non-cash forms. That may be real estate, stocks and bonds, mineral interests, inventory, any number of other ways. And so as we ask about form, it gives us an opportunity sometimes even to expand the thinking of the donor. But I like to do this with a list in hand that identifies some of the different ways that people make contributions, and then ask, which of these have you employed or utilized in your own philanthropic giving? At the appropriate time, what form of gift might you be considering for this project? And so there we're asking about form. Step number 6, asking about amount. You'll recall back on the top, obstacles, one of the most common roadblocks that I hear is, well, I don't know what amount to ask for. So how do we get around that? And the best way I know to suggest is, rather than to guess, is to go to someone who does know, and that is the prospective giver, and ask them that question. As we put together our proposal, what range of gifts should we be asking about? And so now, rather than engaging in the guessing game, we're putting the question in front of the person who is able to arrive at a question. I'll tell you that at one point I was having a conversation along those lines. The response was, our gift would be someplace in the $300,000 to $500,000 range. Well, that's a big range. And so my question was, how will you decide? And when we've got a range of a gift that's been given by the donor, and we ask that question, how will you decide? It helps us, again, to get insight into how they go about addressing their decision, how much to give. And so, again, that amount question is a big one. In the book, I believe that's the largest chapter, the one that talks about asking about amount. And it's one where your personal style will develop the more practice you get. And as with all of these different steps, I would encourage you, where it's something new, to begin by working with a very familiar audience. That may be members of your own board of trustees. But engage in that conversation. What would be the largest amount that you would consider giving if you were fully inspired to give to this particular project or to our specific organization? Step number 7 is asking about timing. There are 2 important time frames to be advised of. One of them is when the gift will be made. That's not the question that we're asking about on step 7, but rather we're asking here, when would be the right time for you to make a decision? And it's natural for us to think, I need a decision today, so I would like you to make your decision today. Well, if we really have to have a decision today, we want to be careful because it's likely to diminish the ultimate gift that the donor might make. And so for that conversation, I want to go back to something that wasn't mentioned earlier, but that's our definition of success. And, we're talking about a $10 million project. At the organizational level, success is raising $10 million for the project. That definition is very appropriate for the nonprofit organization, but it's a whole different approach than our definition of success when it comes to the donor. And you may want to jot this down, but our definition of success at the donor level is to help the donor to make a well-informed decision. We can't hand down a decision, although many times I've heard people approached along these lines. Hi, in order to succeed, our campaign is going to rely on a $1.5 million gift as the lead gift. We've decided that you should be the one to give that gift. That's one of the best ways I know to close a door on a charitable conversation. And so rather than doing that, we want to talk about timing and ask the question, if you were to make a contribution that would be significant for you and perhaps even transformational for our organization, when would be the right time for you to make that decision? So rather than derailing that and putting our timeline in place, we're asking them when's the best time for them to make a decision. Several years ago, I was in a meeting with a very high net wealth individual, extremely wealthy, and we were asking a question along those lines. This had to do with what could have been one of the largest gifts among that leadership gift range, and asked the question, when would be the right time for you to make your gift decision? And this gentleman responded as follows. Said, at this age, my wife and I consider any gifts that we give to be giving away our children's inheritance. And we don't do that anymore without their input and involvement. And so how we go about that is each year at Thanksgiving time, the family is all together, and we set aside time where we talk together about what we want to accomplish with our philanthropy in the year that lies ahead. Now, he told me a number of very extremely valuable things in that process. The most important was that if I needed an answer before Thanksgiving, I would be in trouble. And so naturally, we were happy to wait. Step number 8 has to do with asking about naming. We've had some important news and developments in the area of named gifts recently. But that's a conversation, again, where we want to find out what is the donor's appetite for that. And then step number 9 is asking about deciding. How do you go about making decisions as important as this? At that point, we're ready to step up to step number 10 and make an ask. At that moment, our ask is in the form of a proposal. We looked at an example earlier, and everything on that proposal was advised by our conversation as opposed to being manufactured or just made up arbitrarily on the part of the fundraiser. And so I want to just shift for a moment, share a quote from Martin Luther King Jr. He says, "Faith is taking the first step even when you don't see the whole staircase." And sometimes it's difficult for us to even see the top of the stairs. But let me encourage you to consider that 10-step staircase. Every step doesn't necessarily require a separate meeting, and there will be many times where the relationship is such that we won't need to step on each one of those stairs, but each of those topics are important, and we want to have them addressed by the donor rather than imposed by our own expectation. We're going to wrap up here in just a moment and open up for some questions. I want to ask, as you kind of reflect on the things that we've talked about so far, I want to just ask what you could say is your most important point from today's conversation. And as you think about that, I just want to share some feedback. One of my favorite responses came from someone who works at a food bank. And I'll just read what she wrote. She said, "Kent, your book is clear, concise, and compelling. The advice helped me secure a gift of $70,000 from a generous couple because at every step along the cultivation process, I asked about and listened to their desires. I made the relationship the top priority, and it resulted in a win-win for the donors and our organization." And she wrote, "This gift commitment just came in today, exclamation point." She was excited, and I was very happy for her. It's been fun to be able to help equip people in really elevating the results from their fundraising and getting that kind of feedback in terms of results that they've seen. And so, Laura, at this point, I think this might be a good time for us to open up for questions and be able to be interactive, respond to some of the thoughts and questions that others have.
I think that's a great idea. Let's turn to the operator and see if we have any questions on the phone.
If you'd like to ask a question on the phone, you may signal by pressing *1 on your telephone keypad. You'll hear a tone indicating your line has been placed in the queue and a voice prompt when your line is open. We do ask that you give your name along with your question. Again, that was *1 if you'd like to ask a question on the phone.
Okay, I'll go ahead and take a question from the chat. This is from Michelle Madero. And she's looking for feedback in terms of how she can figure out who to start talking to and how to start the conversation. But how does she actually, she can get in front of them, but how does she actually start the conversation? So that very first step of getting in front of that decision maker.
Okay, how to start the conversation. One of the things that we didn't mention earlier that we certainly recommend and is to involve a call team. By definition, in meeting with our prospective donor, ideally the call team consists of the CEO of the organization and then someone who would be in a peer relationship to that donor. And oftentimes that's a board member, like we mentioned. They may be the intermediary. And so they're going to help open the door by making the introduction. And then what we want to do, as I mentioned before, is kind of give a summary of introducing the organization. What is our mission? What are our programs? What's our track record? Our accomplishments? And if we have a mission, for example, of feeding hungry children, in that introductory meeting, I want to ask a question about, do you have any experience of interacting with children who are having to go without meals? And again, use a kind of an insightful question like that to engage them in the conversation and begin to get acquainted with them, find out what their history is, what their perspective is. But they sometimes may have absolutely no connection and would raise a question, is this something that happens in our community? So again, trying to connect with them at the mission level.
Okay, another great question from Patrice Crawford. What can I do as a fundraising committee chair with no experience to get buy-in from not only executive leadership, but also the board members? I seemingly get no support.
Oh, boy. Patrice, I wish you were the only one that had that kind of that challenge or problem. The most effective thing that we've seen in this area comes back to very specific assignments. And oftentimes what happens, we say, somebody stands up in the boardroom and says, we need everybody's help on this year's fundraising, and then we kind of leave it at that. Buy-in happens when we start, first of all, with leadership by example. And that is, no one can be effective as a fundraiser until they are a fund giver. And so before we ask anybody outside the boardroom for a gift, we need to make sure that everyone, 100% of the people inside the boardroom, have given. So step number one is the board member gives. Step number two is then we ask the question, who else should we be talking to? Engage board members in identifying prospective donors. Once they've done that, then we want to ask the question, who knows this person who can make the introduction? Now, it wouldn't begin to suggest that we're going to turn every person or even any person on our board into a fundraising professional, but everybody there can engage in conversation and they can make introductions. So I would do that, and then as we walk up those steps together, find out what that person's comfort level is in driving the conversation or in just either observing or participating in it. Engage them in a way that is most suitable to them. And my experience has been when we do that all of a sudden they begin to realize that they don't have to do a lot to make a big difference, and it really generates enthusiasm not only in them but in the other members of the board as we go back and share the results.
Okay, we also have a lot of questions around fear of asking face-to-face, asking individuals. So how do we overcome sort of the discomfort or, put that aside in order to start those relationships?
Well, fear is probably the biggest paralyzing force in any of us, and certainly that's among those top 5 obstacles. The most common fear that I run into, people are afraid of rejection, and so they're afraid they're going to be told no. The way that we manage that is we get out of the business of asking yes-no questions, with one exception. Early on in this relationship building process, I want to ask a question, can you ever see yourself being involved in our mission? If the person says no, I don't like you, I don't like your organization, I don't like hungry children, I don't like people who like hungry children, whatever it is, that pretty much gives us a clue that we should be investing our time and effort elsewhere. But that is such a rare occurrence. And oftentimes people say, well, no, how could I be involved? Okay, they've just opened the door. And so the principle that we spend quite a bit of time addressing in the book is that we don't want to ask questions until we're ready for them to be answered. So in the scenario that we looked at, where are we asking? We're asking on step number 10. What does the ask look like? It's a thorough gift proposal, and everything on that gift proposal is there because the donor told us to put it there. And so the way we get out of that fear is we get out of the business of guessing and into the business of asking. Should we be talking about a gift? What would be the appropriate time? What range of gifts should we be talking about? When's the right time for you to make that kind of decision and so forth? Then even when we do have that proposal ready, it's in a draft. I'm not asking you yes or no. I'm asking you, is there anything on this that would need to change in order to gain your enthusiastic approval? And there, if the answer is no, a no to that question is yes to the gift. So again, carefully crafted questions. The other challenge is to work carefully so that we don't put the donor in a position of making a gift commitment before they've been fully prepared to do so.
Okay, let's go back to the operator and see if we have any questions on the phone.
There are no callers keyed up on the phones. Again, that was *1 if you'd like to ask a question.
Okay, in the meantime, we have one more from chat from Christine Burns. Do you share your gift charts with potential funders?
Oh, great question, Christine. And absolutely. And I realize in my work with charitable organizations and countless fundraising professionals, so many times we've left that out of the conversation, and that's a real mistake. One of the benefits of sharing that gift chart is it's a description of the solution to our problem, and so it really makes it all very transparent. There's this thing that's called the principle of proportional giving. And many givers, not everyone, but many givers have in their mind an idea of where they want to be placed in the kind of the hierarchy of donors. And so by providing that gift chart, it gives a point of reference. And they're able to see, if I want to be the top, make the top gift in this project, it's going to be someplace around $1.5 million. If I want to be at the bottom of the top category, the leadership category, then my gift needs to be in the $250,000 range. So again, it's an extremely informative thing. It also makes it very easy for us to talk about numbers. That can be a point of discomfort for many people. It gives us a way to talk about numbers without having to fabricate them. So we end up kind of talking to the paper, and in the process talk about something that's very important to us, and it just makes it more comfortable in the process. So great question, Christine. I hope that's helpful to you.
We also have a couple questions from Nancy Williams. The first is, when we have no choice but to make a cold call, what are the best first words of introduction?
Probably an apology. Well, I would really be interested to know what are the circumstances behind we have no choice but to make a cold call. I will tell you, I have almost never seen positive results come from a cold call. And so it kind of raises the question, how do we warm it up? And that's, one of the reasons why we want to include a third party. That takes all the cold away. But if it's just simply unavoidable, we just encounter somebody on the street, I don't know how this comes about, and we're there to make a gift, I think the first words out of my mouth would be something along the lines of what we shared earlier, and that is, should we be talking about your involvement in this project? And if there's a yes, then I want to pursue it. If there's no, I want to spare everybody the grief and move on to a better prospect.
Okay, and there's another question about board members. There's reluctance to ask for friend support because they're afraid those friends will ask them for support for their organization. So how would you address that?
Yeah, well, that kind of exchange is very common. Excuse me. One of the things we have to determine is who is the best person to connect us with a given prospect. Usually we want to say who is closest to that prospect. Sometimes the person who's closest is too close, and so we want to choose somebody who maybe has a little bit more distance. In fact, there's that question, the prospective donor is somebody that's very close to me, and so close that I don't even know if I should be the one asking them or not. Well, that's another great opportunity, rather than assuming or guessing, is to ask. So I may ask my friend Wesley, Wesley, as close as we are, should I be involved in the conversation about support for Big Brothers Big Sisters, or would it be better for somebody else to be involved in that conversation? So rather than guessing or answering based strictly on my perspective, I want to go back to the donor and say, what's your preference? And that may be answered either way. And regardless of how it is answered, we want to be respectful of that. Let that advice guide our next steps.
We have another question from Brad Gephardt. How do you know how much to ask for? We always hear, I should have asked for more.
Yeah. Well, again, a great question. I think the best way to address that is with one with the gift chart in one hand and the project list in the other. You know, the description of, you know, what does this $10 million go towards. That's where I want to ask the question. First of all, you know, which of these projects is most meaningful to you? And I had a conversation one time with a gentleman who said, you know, the thing that I really want to fund is the deferred maintenance. Well, I'd never heard that response. So I said, talk to me about that. He said, I know deferred maintenance projects are the least attractive to many donors. I think they're extremely important, and so I want to fund the things that I think nobody else cares about. So sometimes our, you know, kind of what we want to accomplish with that, you know, if I want to fund deferred maintenance and we've got $2 million worth there, then I'm going to follow that up with a question of what portion of that would you be comfortable in considering as you think about how you want to be involved in the project. So that's one approach. The other one, like I said, is the gift chart. Excuse me. And I'm just going to bounce back to that real quick. And with that gift chart in hand, ask that question at the appropriate time, when it's time for us to make a request, what amount should we be talking about? And let them respond to this piece, and let that define their response rather than coming up with an arbitrary number. You know, could we count on you for $25,000? That may be our answer, but they may be thinking $250,000 or $1 million. So again, use that gift chart, ask the question, be trusting enough with the relationship that we can ask them that, as opposed to kind of an untrusting approach where it says, I have to guess for them. So, Brad, I hope that's helpful.
We do have a question on the phone. Caller, go ahead.
Hi, this is Debbie Schleiss in Chicago.
Hi, Debbie.
On the first slide with the barriers to doing this process, I was sure I would see getting the visit. Like getting the visit is one of the hardest things to do. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Is that one of your biggest challenges?
Well, it certainly is a time-consuming process.
Yeah. Well, and really that kind of ties in a lot of ways to the one that is listed there, and that's no relationship, which also ties into the cold call thing. So, and you know, I hope this just doesn't sound like a broken record, but again, it's so important that we have that intermediary. And if I don't already know the person, then I'm going to work until I find somebody who does. And even in Chicago, my guess is that we're not going to be more than about 2 or 3 degrees removed from somebody who does know that person. And again, this is where we want to be bold. Hi, my name's Debbie. I'm Executive Director of XYZ Charity, and I am wanting to meet John Doe. I don't know him. I understand that you do. We know each other. Would you introduce me to John?
Yeah.
So, you know, look for that linkage, and I would say don't give up on it. I'll tell you one of the things that has been that I've had to be intentional about. Sometimes I'll be at that large-scale event, and I know the person that I want to meet is going to be there. And so I'll just start asking people in the room that I do know. I don't know John Doe. Do you know him well enough to introduce us? And as soon as I get a yes, make the introduction, and you've got the segue that you were looking for.
Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
Any more questions on the phone?
There are no other callers queued up. Again, that was *1.
Okay, we have a question from Carol Drews asking about, really liking the point that the approach is based on relationship building and not rushing to the ask. But that being said, what timeline is reasonable to get there? 2 to 3 visits, 3 to 5? The challenge of having enough budget time for each donor.
Yeah. Well, Carol, you have a great question and a very common one that I get. And the best thing that I can tell you is that it's a mistake to predefine that. I wish I could tell you that you could get there in 3 visits with everybody. It may be more, it may be less. You're going to have to really evaluate that based on the relationship, which certainly it is, and what are the pressures that are involved, both from an organizational standpoint and from a donor standpoint. And oftentimes that's a question that we just need to put in front of the donor himself or herself. And so in one of those early visits, in each of our visits, I'm going to ask for permission. Let's say we had lunch. Thank you for lunch. This has really been stimulating. I'd like to follow up. Would you be open to a follow-up visit? If the answer is no, send me a proposal. then that's going to tell me how and when I need to go about managing my time and our interaction so that I have enough input. In a nutshell, though, here's what I'd say. It's very rare that one call is enough, and it's also very rare that it requires 10. And so depending on how close or distant the prospect is from our mission, what their history is, if it's a foundation, sometimes it may be a one-time face-to-face meeting and follow up by email or telephone. But the key thing that I could say on that, since it is about the relationship and it's about the individual, let them drive the answer rather than us creating an answer for them.
Okay, Carol Drews asks, how do we get meetings with those who have already given to us? Sometimes the hardest thing is to go back and get a thank you call taken, never mind getting a visit.
One of the things that I kind of miss from when I was in the fundraising shop, when I was at the university, is those thank you calls. And here's my experience. If I try to schedule a visitor call to say thank you, it always gets turned down because the donors, they don't feel like it's deserved or necessary. And so I would get in the business of spontaneous thank you calls. And one of the reasons that you don't want to schedule them is you're likely going to have one of two responses. One, show up, I'm Kent, I wanted to say thank you for your gift. They say you're welcome, and they're ready to go back, and we're done. The other one, which though is more likely, and that is, sit down a minute. And so I came to say thank you. It ends up turning into an opportunity where they may have questions, thoughts, comments, advice. So I don't want to have another appointment backed up against that would prevent me from being responsive to the donor's time frame. And yes, even with busy corporate executives, I don't mind stopping by the office. Depending on who it is, if they're not available for me to pop in and say hi, I may leave the gift receipt behind or whatever, or I may say, when would be a time when I could drop by and catch him for just a moment, catch her between meetings, something. And so again, I want to work that in such a way that the donor is asking for the can we get back together rather than me pursuing them.
We're coming up against the hour, but here's one last question from David Little. Is asking a potential donor this question a mistake? If you were to give to our organization, how would you want me to approach you?
I don't think it's a mistake at all. And the only thing about it that's uncertain is what goes before the question. And think based on it, it's not the first thing that we're going to ask, but I think that's a very insightful one. It's an advice question. People love to give advice, and so you might even frame it in that way. As we begin to get acquainted, rather than presume, let me ask for your advice on this, and then continue. Great question. Wish
Okay, any last question or any comments, Kent, that you'd like to share?
Just a couple things real quick on slide number 11, wrap up, pledge to act. We've talked about some things that are really valuable, and I want to encourage everybody just to decide to do one thing as a result of spending this hour together. The other thing I'll just mention quickly, we've referred several times to the book Asking About Asking. If you don't already have a copy, on the screen there you can see it's available through a variety of sources, whichever one of those is most familiar to you. I will mention that if you are a member of AFP, the Association of Fundraising Professionals, or Charity Channel, there's some very nice discounts that are available. But I would certainly encourage people, if you don't have one, to get the book, and if you do have it, consider providing it to the Board of Trustees, to other members of your staff, and so forth. And then the last thing, and I don't know, if Patricia, if you're on the line as a host, but I thought she had a good suggestion in terms of contact. I am very good at asking for contributions. I'm not good at all at social media, but I'm kind of getting started and would ask for help there. You can see a variety of ways that you can connect with me. And so let me just ask you to go out there and like, tweet, follow something, and get connected and stay involved in the conversation.
Great. Want to thank Kent for sharing his expertise with us. It was a great session. And also thanks to all of you for your participation, all the great questions and interaction over chat. I really appreciate that. And wish you a great afternoon.
Thank you, Laura.
And once again, ladies and gentlemen, that concludes our conference.